So I just want to start with gratitude for our amazing Malchut team, staff, and volunteers who made it possible for me to have a sabbatical. It's amazing that Malchut is at a stage where this is possible. And yeah, and it was a mini sabbatical. I mean, so there isn't a huge amount to tell, but I am going to be focusing in on the Berlin aspect of my time away. I just want to say, like, it's just, I recognize what a privilege it is to be able to take time like this and what a gift it is. And if anyone of you ever has the opportunity to take extended time off from whatever you do all day for work, do it. I just highly recommend it. And I also just want to note that, like, talking about the sabbatical that I took from mid-January through the end of March, it feels like it is because of what's happening in the world and in our city and on campuses right now, like so long ago, like a whole other time and a whole other world. So just want to name that we're in a really challenging moment right now. And yeah, whether we're directly experiencing or witnessing from afar what's happening on college campuses with the, I'm going to call, disproportionate and militarized and overreactive police response to nonviolent protests and encampments in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. And this is related to what I'm going to talk about, with a lot of notions about anti-Semitism being thrown around in the media and elsewhere, and sometimes with anti-Semitism being weaponized. Notions about anti-Semitism ranging from foggy to twisted to like dangerous in terms of what is it that actually keeps Jewish people safe and all people safe. So that's not what this is all about. I'm not going to go into a lecture about that, but I just think I needed to name that. And I'll come back to these things a bit, because when I was in Berlin, I learned, similar things that are happening here are happening there. And I learned a bit about how anti-Semitism gets twisted and used for political ends in Germany as well, which is interesting and troubling given their history, right? So I'm going to, I was away for 2.5 months. I only spent 3 weeks in Berlin, but I'm going to focus on that just to say quickly just touch on some other things that I did do during my sabbatical. I did a wonderful Institute for Jewish Spirituality silent meditation retreat in Los Angeles. And when I was out there, I visited Ikar for Shabbat. Ikar is a startup spiritual community it's no longer a startup, that was founded 20 years ago by Rabbi Sharon Brous. And is one of the models that influences what we do. And she's amazing. And we're going to bring some of the music I heard there into an upcoming Kabbalat Shabbat service. And I spent time with myself, which I needed, taking care of myself, and with family and friends, and enjoying our beautiful city here too. So, I have a lot to say, but it's not going to take up 45 minutes. That's too much. So like, if you have questions or things you want to talk about, or, please save them up, and then we'll open it up for more dialogue. And welcome to folks who just joined us. Wonderful. So first, why did I go? Why did I decide to go to Berlin, to Germany for 3 weeks? And also really like very aware. When I was there, I was taking German classes. I was in a very international group. I was the only American in my German class, which is not a surprise because Americans don't do this. And when I would say to the, Japanese or Australian or British or Lebanese or whoever was what I was doing, and say, I've been here for 3 weeks, like, oh, we're traveling for a year. We're traveling for 5 months, so 3 weeks is like nothing. It's nothing. It's so American to be like 3 weeks. So anyway, but why did I go? So many of you probably know that my mother's side of my family are German Jews, some of whom came to this country via Queens, many of them, in 1938, and some of whom either escaped or survived the Shoah and went to Palestine, now Israel, and many of whom were also murdered by the Nazis. But so, like I think many of us who grew up with those roots, I didn't grow up with a strong connection to Germany, surprisingly. I grew up with a really strong connection to Israel, and identification with Israel and my Israeli family, and I'm fluent in Hebrew, and I got very deeply involved working for human rights for Palestinians. And, that was like where my work was in terms of identity beyond the United States. And like until the last decade or so, I never really thought much about the fact actually that my family's roots were not actually there. Like my family's roots were actually in Europe. And I think that has something to do with the history of Jewish nationalism. But I'm not going to go deeply into that analysis tonight. But so I'm not exactly sure what sparked my kind of interest in like going to Germany finally and learning German. And a bunch of us in my family right now are pursuing our German citizenship. But I do think part of it does have to do with feeling more and more alienated from Israel over the years, working in human rights, seeing what's happening, obviously seeing what's happening now. It's become very fraught. And then hearing about like more and more lefty Israelis moving to Berlin, like that all kind of planted some seeds for me. Like, why are they going there? That's interesting, of all places. So for whatever reason, I've been exploring my connection to my diaspora roots for the past decade or so. About 7 years ago, I took a trip with my cousin from the same side of the family, and we visited the villages outside of Frankfurt that we are from, our grandparents are from. And I felt really at home there. Like I felt really, like there are obviously reasons to feel uncomfortable, which I felt in various places and times, but I also felt home, and it was a surprise. So I wanted to go back. Like it was very moving to be there. And then I heard amazing things about Berlin just as a city. Like for someone who's a city girl, who's a New York City girl, I heard if you like New York, you're gonna love Berlin, and it's really true. And it's on the other side of Germany from where my family is from. So like I had this nice kind of emotional, psychological distance. And I could really fully enjoy being there without kind of being brought to tears constantly, which is sort of what it was like being in Frankfurt. So anyway, so I decided, I wanted to have an immersive experience there, as immersive as we Americans get, 3 weeks, that would help me to grow in whatever ways, and to explore my identity. So what we did, Jim, my husband, and I, we were there together for a week, kind of being tourists, but like intentionally Jewish tourists. We attended Shabbat services there and Shabbat meal at the Neue Synagogue together, which was fascinating. We stayed in an Airbnb in Mitte, which is, the part of Berlin that was East Berlin was much bigger than the part of Berlin that was West Berlin. So the center of Berlin, which is Mitte, was actually East Berlin, if that makes sense. So that's the area where we stayed, and it's more kind of upscale, older, pretty architecture as opposed to like the really brutal communist architecture. That's where we stayed, and it's close to the Jewish section of the city. So I'm gonna share my screen I'm not gonna do a lot of I'm not seeing this as a slideshow, but I'll share some photos just to give you a sense. Except participant screen sharing has been disabled.
Because maybe I have to make you a photo.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay. There we go. So this is a fun thing. There's a picture of me in the U-Bahn station, the subway station, and you see the word Weinbergsweg there. That's the street that our Airbnb happened to be on. And my family name, my German family name is Weinberg. And it just like happened coincidentally. So and I was exhausted. I mean, I made Jim take that picture of me after we had like flown in and taken public transportation to get to the Airbnb, but worth sharing. So anyway, we stayed in an Airbnb in Mitte together for a week. We toured around, and then I stayed on for 2 more weeks and took an intensive German course at the Goethe Institute. When Jim and I were there, we saw it's called the East Side Gallery, which is sections of the Berlin Wall that artists have created really interesting political art. That's just one thing we did. So I'll just show you some pictures of that. That's Rolf, my German teacher. Yeah. So we had a really good time. So I just want, and you can ask me about any of it. I'm just going to give you like 4 or 5 story/reflections just to draw out some themes and try and give you some visuals as I go, if I can make it work. Overall, like the way I would describe the experience overall of being there is of being in all these traveling between and sometimes simultaneously being in multiple layers of history, memory, and present day, like moving between them, but sometimes being in more than one at the same time, if that makes sense. And there's such richness in the present chapter of Berlin. It's post-reunification, all these different waves of immigrants. You hear Turkish, you hear all kinds of Asian languages, you hear Arabic, you hear Hebrew, you hear some German, and same with the food, and so like it's very rich in the present, and then yet you look up, and almost anywhere you go, you see do you only see Rolf? Okay. No. Oh, okay. Okay. So actually, wait, this is the picture I want. Do you see this tall tower? The tower, right? The communists put this TV tower in when they divided the city, in East Berlin, and it's still there in Alexanderplatz. And there's a whole story about it that I don't have time to tell. But so you're just like, oh, right, this was a divided city, right? Every time you look up, you see it and you remember this was a communist divided. Like I'm in East Berlin, I'm in West Berlin, whatever, but you can see that from everywhere. So you sort of look up and that's what you see. And then when you look down, you see Stolpersteine, these stumbling stones that are outside of homes and businesses where Jewish families used to live, from which they were deported and murdered, right? So, right, like you just walking around, you look up, you see the tower, that's like one way to kind of encapsulate the experience. And then you see, segments of the Berlin Wall, like I showed you before. And then like the present is so alive and amazing. The public transit is really great. They have public bathrooms there. It's so nice. So one thing, one story, which I think Jim actually told part of the story at Kabbalat Shabbat after he got back. I got connected with Rabbi Geza Ederberg, who is a conservative movement rabbi, German-born, converted to Judaism woman. As is her husband. Same story. That's a whole, and you can ask me about that later because there's a whole thing about that. It's fascinating. So she is the rabbi of the Neue Synagogue, which is this big, beautiful, partially restored synagogue. in Berlin. And anyway, but she invited us. It just happened to be the anniversary of the last deportations of Jews from Berlin by the Nazis, right? One of the days that we were there. And every year there's a ritual that they do at one of the memorials, and then people walk through the street to another memorial for another ritual. So we came along. She invited us along. And I can show you pictures from that. That is the Stolperstein again. That's Rolf. Okay. All right. So this is actually the second memorial. So I'll talk about it in a moment. So first there was a ritual at a memorial for the sort of the last wave of deportations where Jews who were working in factories. And factories were like one room factories. Okay, don't think massive giant things. And folks living in like old age homes. And so there's an old Jewish cemetery, and there's a memorial right there, which it was the spot from which those groups were deported east to the camps. So there was this beautiful ceremony, most of which I didn't understand, except Kaddish. And then, I mean, and there were hundreds of people, hundreds of all ages, from children all the way up to people with gray hair and everything in between. And these hundreds of people we took to the street, and we were walking down the middle of a Berlin street. It was very moving, to this memorial that you see a picture of here. This memorial is the Rosenstrasse Memorial. So some of the last Jews to be rounded up were German Jewish men who were married to non-Jewish German women, and many of them had children. And these men were detained in a hotel, former hotel on Rosenstrasse. And towards the end of the war. And these women held vigil and protest outside of that hotel like every day for months in the bitter cold, demanding that the Nazis release their husbands, risking their lives, risking everything. And amazingly, their husbands were actually released. Yeah. So this is one of the earliest memorials in the city. I think it might have been constructed in East Berlin, if I'm getting my history right. There's a bench with a figure sitting on it several meters away to sort of show the people's just sitting by, watching, witnessing, and not intervening. So those are the memorials, and that's what the event was. But the reflection that I had that I want to share. So the processional was really moving to me. And I turned to my colleague, Geza, the rabbi, and I was like, wow, like, look at all these Jews publicly walking in the middle of the street in Berlin. Like, that's amazing, right? Just claiming the space. And she says to me, I was so ignorant, right? These are not Jews. There were some Jews among the group, but Berliners were in the habit since communist times. This is a ritual that started under communism. They were in the habit of showing up for this memorial every year. And then even after unification, other people started to join, but it was mostly non-Jews who were remembering these deportations. And there's all kinds of politics probably related to communism, and they were probably only really allowed to sort of publicly mourn, or the main political message of those older protests was probably like they were killing, the Nazis killed communists. And you saw some, and workers, right. But like, it's just, you think what's going on, and no, you don't. So I thought that was fascinating. Part of the ritual was in remembrance of the resistance to the Nazis. Folks laid white roses all over that monument, and it was just quite beautiful. So that's one reflection. Another is about Jewish life in Berlin. So just to give you some statistics and then talk about my experiences. I visited 2 different synagogues while I was there. One was this Neue Synagogue, and I can show you a picture of that. That's not it. Oh, wait, never mind. See, oh, that's right. I had it elsewhere. There it is. That gives you sort of a sense of it. I know what I'm doing is not the most beautiful presentation ever. I just sort of cobbled this together. Like, I mean, it's narrow. It's not like the red buildings on either side are either residential or there's actually like a museum and kind of a community center. So it's pretty narrow, and only the facade back, I don't know how many meters, was restored. There's a whole giant part of it that was actually bombed by the Allies. There's a whole, and I'm not going to go into the whole history of the synagogue, but it's fascinating. Like the local police basically stopped the Nazis from burning it down on Kristallnacht. So, but then the Allies ended up, bombing it anyway. But this is one of the synagogues we went to. That's where Rabbi Geza is the rabbi. And then I also went to the Frankalufa synagogue a few times. And the experience was very dry. It was very dry. I mean, there was something very cool happened. I went to a bat mitzvah at the Neue Synagogue of like a young woman from the former Soviet Union. Her family's from the former Soviet Union. Most of the Jews, I should back up. I was gonna give you context first. And I'll talk about why it was the dryness on the services. So when Hitler came to power in 1933, there were probably about 160,000 Jews living in Berlin, constituting a third of German Jewry. Does that sound right? I think that's right. By 1943, Berlin was declared free of Jews, although there were 7,000 Jews remaining in the city. So from 1933 to 1943, went from 160,000 to 7,000, just to give you a sense. And I met some people at the Frankalufer synagogue who are descendants of those originals. There are still Jews who are the descendants of the original 7,000. Yeah. One of them is a leader in the synagogue, and he's like my generation, it's like Gen X, maybe a little younger. It's fascinating. But today there are probably between 30 and 45,000 Jews living in Berlin. Most of them had come from the former Soviet Union. Either they were living in East Berlin, but they probably came from further east, and that was like in the 90s when lots of former Soviet Jews were leaving. And I read that maybe about 10,000 of the Jews in Berlin right now are Israeli expats. Just a big number. Yeah. So anyway, so I went to services. The services were pretty dry. They did use I grew up classical reform, and they used some melodies that I remember growing up because classical reform is Germanic. So, and that was fun for me, but I was like, why are you still singing this? And one of the takeaways I had that I heard, basically no one is happy. Like I was just like the Jews are not happy, not just because of politics, but like religiously, there's no separation between church and state. There's this ethos that really limits creativity. There's this ethos that, look, we're back. Welcome back. Aren't you grateful to be back in your synagogue? And the ethos is sort of like, we should keep the synagogue looking and sounding and acting the way it was before the war, kind of as a way to say, we're back. Right. So like, I didn't go to the synagogue, but one of the earliest Reform temples is in Berlin. And back in the day, they had separate seating, but they had an organ, right? And they prayed in German, that's how Reform Judaism kind of evolved. They never made it to being egalitarian. They never got to that point in the evolution. But today, that temple still has separate seating and still has an organ, so, and at the Frankalufer synagogue, there's this actually really vibrant community of younger people who want to be bringing innovation and creativity, but they've been assigned a rabbi through the Jewish council. You know, their tax funds pay him. And when he comes twice a month, there's separate seating, there's no instruments. It's an Orthodox synagogue. And when the rabbi isn't there, then they have an egalitarian service and they have some instruments and, you know, they get to run their own shul. So the reason why, you know, I think I was hearing a lot of Germanic music is like, it was interesting. I spoke to an Israeli expat cantor who is now serving a synagogue north of Berlin, I think. He was at this bat mitzvah and I was talking to him about the music, and he said something that he really believes needs to happen is there needs to be an indigenous movement of innovation and innovating new German Jewish liturgical music or new German Jewish music. All they do is either sing the old stuff or they import stuff from Israel and the United States, like what we sing, you know, in our services, but they don't yet have like an indigenous German Jewish repertoire. So that was fascinating. But there's just a lot of sense of kind of limitation there. So, and control by the state of what it means to be a Jew. There are some independent communities, and I wasn't able to see them on Shabbat because the timing didn't work out. So I hope to go back. So they may have a different story, but most of the Jews I talked to were just kind of dissatisfied with Jewish life, and the sense of control. So, which brings me to my next to last reflection, I think. Yeah. Anti-Semitism. So Germany, as a country, actually the United States has done this too, but I think in a slightly more nuanced way, they have fully adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. You may have heard this. It's the IHRA, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which really, I have to say, has been sort of shopped around by right-wing elements in the Jewish community to various governments, universities, right? The vote that just happened in Congress yesterday in our own country was same thing, right? That the Department of Education needs to adopt this particular definition of anti-Semitism, which includes a list of examples that includes basically certain ways of criticizing Israel can be kind of categorized as anti-Semitism according to this definition. So the atmosphere there, I mean, it's interesting. It felt more challenging there than here when I was there, like in February, March. But now that I'm here and the campus stuff is happening, now I actually feel like we're kind of in the same place. It's fascinating. There are, you know, when I was there was the Berlin Film Festival was going on, and there was an Israeli-Palestinian pair of filmmakers who won a prize for their documentary, not about the current war in Gaza, but about, I can't remember, I think it was about dispossession of Palestinians, like shepherds in the southern West Bank, in the South Hebron Hills. Anyway, they got a prize. And in the acceptance speech, the Israeli Jew criticized the Israeli assault on Gaza. And then he got called out by the mayor of Berlin, who is not Jewish, right, in the press as being anti-Semitic. And this is like just one example, right, of what's going on there, what it's like. So this bizarre situation where Jews who are publicly condemning Israeli action are being labeled anti-Semitic by non-Jewish German public officials. So just let that sink in for a moment, because it was a lot to process. I had a really interesting meeting with some Jewish lefty activists, and they work with, one of them works with the Diaspora Alliance, and you can look them up. They work all over the world. And much of their work is focused on advocating for a more nuanced understanding of anti-Semitism that actually protects Jews and isn't weaponized, right? And so she was explaining to me that, like, while I was there, they were fighting a bill that was up for a vote in the German parliament that would require all of the concentration camp memorial sites in Germany to include an exhibit about Israel, like this, the founding of the state of Israel, and supporting the founding of the state of Israel. Okay, which, like, there's a place for that, but is that the place for that? You know, so, and she would, you know, they were having sort of high level meetings with people in the Department of Cultural Affairs or whatever departments in the government, you know, to try and unpack, like, why that's a problem and why that's propaganda. So now, this doesn't mean that actual anti-Semitism doesn't happen and isn't real. And obviously, you know, we're experiencing it in this country. It is happening there. There's a far-right political party, the AfD, that is gaining more popularity there, which is scary. And, you know, after October 7th, an Orthodox synagogue in Berlin had a Molotov cocktail thrown in it. I was actually there was a little protest that apparently happened every week in the neighborhood where we lived. I don't know if I told you about this, Jim. Not a group of non-Jews who had an ongoing, like, weekly solidarity protest in solidarity with the Jewish community against anti-Semitism. And it seemed to be really against real anti-Semitism, right? So that was interesting. You may have heard that in January, there was like this giant march, like maybe 1 million Germans were out in the streets against, like, protesting against far-right extremism, after a report had revealed that leaders of that far-right party had gathered near Wannsee, right, which in 1942, that's where the Nazis came up with the final solution. They had gathered near Wannsee to secretly discuss plans about deporting foreigners, including those who are foreigners who are now German citizens. So, like, it's real, but yeah, so fascinating. I'll just close with, like, a little description of more happy things and interesting things just to close, and I would love questions. Oh my gosh, I did talk for almost 45 minutes. Okay. It was amazing to see so many Jews in Berlin, to hear Hebrew. Like, there were rabbinical students in all these congregations really active because there are rabbinical seminaries near Berlin. You know, and I told you about this bat mitzvah that I saw. You know, we're sitting in a gymnasium of a Jewish day school, packed for this bat mitzvah, and overlooking this empty plaza where the sanctuary of the Neue Synagogue used to stand that was bombed out. Like, these layers, you know, of history and memory and joy and trauma and rebirth, and immigration and ideas about deportation, right? Like, all of it happening in the same place at the same time. And the food was, like, really good. And I'll just show you a picture of some coffee and cake. But I would love your questions. So let me just show you. You can. Oh, this is the Israeli flag outside of the Rathaus, the city hall in Berlin. Right, there's Ukrainian flags and an Israeli flag and German flags. Just noting that. Interesting. Our favorite German chocolate, Ritter Sport. So we had some fun, and that was, like, the best cafe und Kuchen that I had the whole time. And I don't think people on Zoom can hear this, but you can see this amazing klezmer jam that I went to in a packed bar. So. All right, how do I turn it off? Okay, so I would love to hear your questions, open this up for a conversation, and to say also, I'm not, like, an expert. I was just kind of soaking in what I could.
I have a
Yeah,
question,
sure.
sort of just like an interpersonal question. So
Yeah.
when you were speaking to, different Jewish people that live in Berlin at the synagogues and things like that, and, they, knew you were a rabbi from New York, what were like did they have any interesting perceptions of what they think like Jewish life is like in New York?
So interesting. So first of all, I will say that they had so much to say about what's going on for them. They did not ask me a lot of questions.
Okay.
But also I was like really, really curious. Maybe I didn't give them enough room. But there were a couple of people I met with who like I shared about this phenomenon. None of them had heard about this phenomenon of like startup synagogues, creative, new, innovative Jewish projects happening all over the United States. And so that's something that they had never heard of and were really inspired by. And like, I wish we could have that here kind of thing. And saying like, but you couldn't get it funded through public funds. So I don't know how you do it. And I mean, that was interesting. I met with the head of a Jewish museum and cultural center, educational center that's hosted at the Neue Synagogue. I couldn't believe it. She had never heard of UJA Federation. But we like kind of commiserated about funding and grant seeking and the politics of that. And that was really interesting. So yeah. Any other? Even just like your thoughts about what I've shared doesn't even have to be questions. I'm trying to everybody. Yeah.
So let me highlight you.
That okay. Yeah, Jonathan, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna ask about the rabbis who came in twice a month, and if there was another like audience, there was another group of Jews who was like with them. Are there divisions like within these communities that
That's a great question.
that you might have noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think in that particular community, the Franke Synagogue, there are probably some folks who would like it, but they're probably, older folks, who may prefer that it stay Orthodox. But it really, I don't know, they had a really full, rich, beautiful Shabbat dinner after there was a Shabbat lunch, I think I went to on a Saturday. Really, most of the people showing up are like Gen X and younger and really want a change. Like it was clear because I talked to a lot of people around that table. So no, my sense is that at least in that particular situation, the rabbi has a nice gig. He has a salary, he has a job, and he phones it in. And I haven't met him, and it's not to cast aspersions on a colleague necessarily, but I think like the system lends itself to that. I don't know that I noticed divisions, but I did notice was sort of impatient, frustrated, dissatisfied congregants and rabbis who were like a little too relaxed. Like where they could have been building something, but there was no reason that they really had to.
Yeah, I mean, the skill that's rewarded is managing your relationship to the Gemeinde, not building a community.
Explain what the
So
Gemeinde
the Gemeinde is the Jewish communal organization that pays the rabbis. So they're the recipient of the government funds that enable the Jewish community to exist. And that is not just a Jewish thing. Like Lutherans and the Evangelical Church in Germany exists in the exact same way, where they're just given somebody who's paid by the state, who their primary relationship is with the state government organ that pays them, not with the
by Kate. Yeah, that was Jim, by the way. I think everyone here knows who that is. Yeah. Julie.
I just was curious, like I was confused. So the Orthodox rabbi uses the organ but has separate seating, or is this a separate synagogue?
That was yet a different synagogue. That was
okay.
It was a Reform temple, but Reform in the 19th century understanding.
Oh, okay.
19th century understanding of it.
So the rabbi for that synagogue is Reform.
I would assume so, but I don't know. I don't know the.
Okay. So I mean, so the German government does recognize like different denominations.
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, no, and the way it works is the Jewish Council of the state, like you, as a Jew, you can sign up to be known by the state as a Jew and to be known as belonging to a particular synagogue. And then your piece of your tax money then goes to your synagogue through that structure. So yeah, so they do, so the Gemeinde, that umbrella, holds all the different denominations of Judaism.
So it seems like that and Israel really show that like the separation of church and state are really like a good thing. Like, yeah, it just sounds like it's like, I mean, it's also like sort of like what Republicans always say about like government and things, you know, like when things are done by government, it's not as good as, you know, I mean, and I don't agree with that, you know, but in this case, it sounds like it is, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Can you let
Yeah.
Marina, for some reason I'm like frozen and I
Oh,
can't
here.
click on anything. I don't know why.
Do they,
Mhm.
do people have to join a synagogue? Do they have to pay dues, or is that like?
So you don't pay dues, you just pay taxes. But I guess you pay more in taxes.
So you pay, it's a
You-
0.5% tax if you don't. And like, you can opt out of it, but a lot of people don't, you know.
But that covers the rabbi, Hebrew school, like
Yeah,
Mhm.
everything.
but they fundraise. I mean, these rabbis
They-
and the rabbis who are actually like, and the communities that have motivation,
Mhm,
they fundraise outside of that.
Okay.
They have to,
right.
in order to really grow. Yeah.
What about like day schools? Do they have those? And like, how are those funded?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it's funded. I actually, the rabbi was talking about some fundraising when we were there for the day school.
But it was grants from the state.
It was grants from the state. That's right. Yeah, which also means, right, you have to be careful about what's in your curriculum,
Mhm.
right? You have to be careful about what you say as a rabbi. Or your job could be in danger. So that also, like that whole dynamic around anti-Semitism, Israel, et cetera, is everyone's navigating it in some way. But yes, so there's a Jewish day school. I'm trying to remember, I don't remember much about. Do you remember anything that she said about who the kids are?
And it's not just Jewish
It's not
kids.
just Jewish kids. That's right. It's open to everybody.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, and
Um,
it's sort of like, it's considered sort of an elite school. It's sort of like
Right.
a Stuyvesant, Bronx Science sort of thing where people are like trying to get their kids into the Jewish school.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like Stuyvesant, but with a rabbi on
Is that
staff.
like the Jews definitely get in, and then what's left over, like the non-Jews fight for it, or like do they?
Yeah, it wasn't clear to me that it
That's
was. yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any other, maybe one last question before we move, because, or how much time do we have? Oh, we're over time. Okay. We need to move on with our cross circle agenda, I think. Thank you for your interest. I hope that was interesting and it was fun to share, and I'm sure I'll have more to share in other ways.